Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about the ongoing problem that Russia now has with regards to making and receiving payments. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll be aware that over the last 2 years, Russia has significantly increased the level of trade that it's doing with China. And initially, there were no problems with regards to that trade because China was completely exempt from all of the sanctions. It wasn't taking part in the sanctions that had been applied by the West, and so Russia was able to deal freely with China. However, over the last 12 months or so, there's been a significant ramping up in the threat of secondary sanctions. And at the end of 2023, the USA tightened all of the regulations to make sure that Chinese financial institutions were aware that they were facing the risk of being sanctioned themselves if they allowed payments to and from Russia. And following on from the introduction of those tightened regulations, Janet Yellen from the USA actually made a trip over to China and met with some of the large financial institutions and made it very clear to them that the USA was cracking down on all of these payments. Now, as a result of that, there was a large increase in the number of payments that were being made by middlemen, other institutions that thought that they could avoid all of these sanctions. However, the USA is now focusing in on all of those middlemen as well. And Russia is now being forced to move into the world of cryptocurrency. And there's also some talk that barter deals are now taking place between Russia and China, where payments aren't actually being made, they're swapping quantities of goods. So in today's video, we'll go through the details of the increase in the trade with China. We'll have a look at how important China is to Russia and how important Russia is to China, and there is a big difference between those two levels. We'll also have a look at what's been happening with payments. We'll then talk about these increased sanctions that the USA announced at the end of 2023. We'll then have a look at what's happening with regards to cryptocurrency and how the West is now starting to crack down on Russia's use of crypto. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the implications for the Russian economy are of the crackdown on these payments to and from Russia, and what's likely to happen over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. But before we get started on all of that, I've got some really exciting news for you. I've decided to give away another one of my sculptures, and it's this piece, which is called Windswept Clock, because it's actually got a fully functioning clock built into it, and it's by a British artist called Paul Margetts, who I've got a lot of different pieces from, and I think this is absolutely fantastic. It's really heavy. This would look amazing in anybody's place. And you can win this by entering into the prize draw, and the tickets are priced at only £1 each, which is around $1.30. So if you want to support the channel, rather than buying me a coffee or sending me a YouTube super thanks, why don't you buy a ticket and you could win this thing, and you can follow on from the previous winners like Craig in Australia, who won the little red balloon dog, and Lars from the Netherlands, who won Stiltman. And there is a potential, if you do win, that you may have to pay some import duty. I don't think Craig or Lars did, so maybe you won't. And I'm getting an independent company to organise everything for me, so it's all above board. I won't be involved in drawing the winner. That's entirely at random. But if you'd like to win this, an original Joe Blog sculpture, you can't buy these things, you can only win them, then have a look at the details below and buy a ticket, and good luck. These two charts show the level of trade between Russia and China between 1996 and 2023. And the scale on the left-hand side of both of these charts is shown in billions of US dollars and goes from 0 at the bottom to 120 billion at the top. And the top chart we've got here, shown in blue, shows Russia's exports to China, so all of the things that Russia is sending to China, and the bottom chart in orange shows the value of Russia's imports from China. And what you can see here is that over the last 27 years, there have been 4 distinct phases. Between 1996 and 2008, there was a steady increase in the level of exports from Russia to China, with the value rising from $5.2 billion to around $22 billion. At the same time, the level of imports that Russia was buying from China increased from $1.7 billion to around $30 billion. There was a drop in both the level of exports and imports in 2009 as a result of the global financial crisis which struck the world economy in 2008. However, between 2010 and 2014, there was an increase in the volume of exports, which got up to around $40 billion, and there was also an increase in the volume of imports, which rose to around $50 billion. 2014 was the year that Russia invaded Crimea, and as a result of that, it was hit by a variety of sanctions, and the level of trade that it did with the world started to fall. However, it soon started to recover, and by 2019, the level of exports from Russia to China had risen to $60 million, and the level of imports was back up to around $50 billion. But I think the most striking thing about this chart is what's happened in terms of the amount of trade between Russia and China over the past 3 years. Obviously, Russia invaded Ukraine at the start of 2022, and since that time, we have seen an enormous increase in the volume of exports, which got up to $129 billion by the end of 2023. And at the same time, there was also a rapid increase in the amount of imports from China, which rose to $111 billion. And in terms of the breakdown of the exports from Russia to China, this chart shows the monthly sales that Russia was making between 2021 and 2023. And you can see that by far the largest category of exports was crude oil, followed by oil products, pipeline gas, liquefied natural gas, coal, and then a variety of other products. And in terms of the items that Russia is importing from China, this chart shows the categories, and you can see that the largest single category was machinery, so basically manufactured goods, followed by electronics, which obviously is a catch-all for a variety of different products. Vehicles were the third largest single category, and then there was a variety of other goods. And if you take a step back and look at the trend here, excluding the period immediately following the invasion of Ukraine, when there was disruption to all trade with Russia, you can see that there is a clear rising trend in terms of the amount that Russia is importing from China. This chart shows a percentage breakdown of the level of trade that Russia is doing with China, both for exports and imports. And this is really interesting because if you look at the situation back in 1996, China only represented 5.6% of Russia's total exports. However, today it represents 30.5%. So almost 1/3 of all of the income that Russia is earning from its exports is now coming from China. And if we look at the situation for imports, the movement is actually even greater. Back in 1996, China only accounted for 2.2% of all of Russia's imports. However, at the end of 2023, China accounted for 36.5%. So more than 1/3 of everything that Russia is spending on imports is going directly to China. And what this tells us is that China is now an incredibly important player in terms of Russia's international trade, not just for its exports, but also for sourcing its products for its imports. And this chart shows exactly the same data, but looks at how important Russia is to China's business. So if we start off with the blue section, back in 1996, Russia accounted for 3.7% of all of the goods that China was importing. Today, that figure has only risen to 5.1%. So despite the fact that there's been a huge increase in the amount that Russia is exporting to China, because China is such a big economy and it's buying in tons of different things from all around the world, the amount that it's sourcing from Russia has only increased by 1.4%. And if we look at the situation for China's exports, back in 1996, Russia accounted for 1.1% of all of China's income from its exports. Today, it accounts for 3.3%. So that represents a significant movement, but Russia still only accounts for 3.3% of China's total exports. And what this chart tells us is that Russia is simply not as important to China as China is to Russia. In a worst-case disaster scenario, it would be much easier to find a replacement for 3 or 5% of your imports or exports compared with 30 or 36% from Russia's perspective. At the end of 2023, Joe Biden's administration announced that it would focus on dealing with all financial institutions that were assisting payments to Russia and make sure that those institutions were facing the risk of secondary sanctions. So basically, secondary sanctions is a situation whereby an institution can be hit with the same sanctions that are applied to Russia if it's found that they are dealing with the Russian entities that are sanctioned. So this basically runs the risk of losing all of your business with the West if you're a large Chinese bank. And as we've just identified, the relative amount of business coming from Russia to China is small compared to the rest of the world. And as a result of that, Chinese institutions definitely don't want to risk the whole of their overseas business to facilitate payments to Russia. Now, as I mentioned at the start of today's video, one of the ways that Chinese financial institutions had found to work around this problem was by the use of middlemen, very small financial institutions that are not related to any of the big banks. Following Vladimir Putin's visit to China in May 2024, a number of specially authorized banks were set up in border regions close to Russia to allow Russian firms to open non-resident accounts with Chinese banks, a step that has become more important since the Russian bank VTB's Shanghai branch was targeted with sanctions. One of the loopholes with regards to making payments between Russia and China was that the Russian bank VTB had a branch in Shanghai, so technically this wasn't a Chinese financial institution, it was a Russian financial institution that was located in China with a banking license. And VTB was handling a huge volume of payments between the two countries. However, that branch has now been specifically hit with sanctions. So anybody that now deals with the Shanghai branch of VTB faces the risk of secondary sanctions. The US Treasury announced that it was modifying sanctions on previously targeted Russian banks, including VTB and Sberbank, to include branches and subsidiaries in China, India, Hong Kong, Kazakhstan and other international locations. And by doing this, it will stop future payments being processed by those institutions. Using banks in border regions makes it easier for go-betweens working on behalf of Russian companies to flip between them. The scheme, involving small banks with limited or no business with countries which Russia considers unfriendly, also reduces the potential fallout for China. These smaller regional banks are, for the time being, flying below the USA's sanctions radar and show how Moscow and Beijing are having to take increasingly complex steps to ensure bilateral payments continue to be made, but at the same time exposes some Chinese financial institutions to US sanctions. However, the window for them to carry out payments for Russian companies may be narrowing, as a senior US Treasury official recently said that it's working towards identifying smaller banks with weaker compliance departments that are still helping to process transactions that aid Russia's military output. Russian commodity firms struggling to execute financial transactions with Chinese counterparts have now started tapping a new method for settling deals: stablecoins. Some metal producers have begun to use Tether Holdings Limited stablecoin and other cryptocurrencies to settle some of their cross-border transactions with mostly Chinese clients and suppliers. Ivan Kozlov, an expert on digital currencies, said with stablecoins, the transfer may take just 5 to 15 seconds at a cost of a few cents, making such transactions pretty efficient when the sender already has an asset base in stablecoins. Tether's USDT stablecoin is pegged to the US dollar, which makes it even more convenient for exporters and means that it doesn't have the wild fluctuations in terms of valuation of other cryptocurrencies. The alternative is often slower transactions or worse, risking an overseas bank account that could be frozen. Some unsanctioned companies open dozens of accounts in different countries only to see them frozen one after the other. Using cryptocurrencies for payments is not unusual for countries under sanctions. Transactions for cargo from Venezuela, home to the world's largest proven crude reserves, are increasingly done using Tether. Many of the deals, which happen at steep discounts, are brokered through intermediaries based in Dubai. Crypto's growing role in settlements also indicates a shift in Russia's central bank's approach to the industry. Previously, the Bank of Russia had considered a blanket ban on the use and creation of all cryptocurrencies, But in November, the Bank of Russia's governor, Elvira Nabiulina, told Parliament that she supports experimenting with such payments in international transactions. The Russian regulator has advised Russian financial institutions that cryptocurrency payments are only acceptable for cross-border transfers, so basically payments out of Russia or into Russia, and that such deals should not be advertised. And it's been reported that Russian lawmakers are considering legislation to create a legal framework for the use of stablecoins in international transactions. The Russian central bank has also announced recently that it's observed a significant rise in cryptocurrency activity among Russians in recent quarters. Crypto-linked banking services in Russia are also expanding, with Rosbank becoming the first Russian lender to start cross-border payments with cryptocurrency for businesses in June 2023. Since that time, other banks have also started similar payment services. And if we look at this table, it shows the trading volume for cryptocurrencies in 2023 for European countries. You can see that Russia was ranked right at the top with around $634 billion worth of trading. But one of the interesting things to look at here is the trading volume compared to the average monthly wage, which came in at 63.5%. So what that means is that the annual trading volume for individuals equates to around 2/3 of their monthly wage. And if you look at how that compares to the other countries, in the UK, which is a close second to Russia in terms of the volume of cryptocurrency trading, it was only 26.5%. In France, it was 16.6%, and Germany 10.7%. Now, one of the other figures that jumps off the page here is the figure for Ukraine, which equated to almost 260% of the monthly wage. And I think that really reflects the disruption to the financial service in Ukraine right now, and also the fact that the Ukrainian currency is all over the place. People are feeling more confident keeping their money in crypto. And if we have a look at the same data for the USA, you can see that it's the largest market in terms of trading volume, over $2 trillion worth of trading in 2023. But if you look at the volume of trading compared to the average monthly wage, it was less than 12% compared with 63.5% in Russia. And if we quickly have a look at a couple of other countries that we follow on the channel, in Turkey, the total trading volume was almost $1.4 trillion US, and the trading volume compared to average monthly wage was 324%. And that really reflects the fact that firstly, Turkey is in a state of economic crisis, and secondly, the people in Turkey have lost confidence in the Turkish lira, and so they're looking for other avenues to put their money into, and stablecoin and Bitcoin and other forms of crypto are somewhere that they feel more comfortable rather than holding it in Turkish lira. And if we look at the situation in Argentina, the total trading volume was around $100 billion, and the percentage compared with the monthly wage was almost 44%. And once again, this reflects the fact that people in Argentina have lost confidence in the Argentine peso. So if we go back to the figures for Russia, what this shows is that in 2023, the trading volume in crypto was already at a very high level, and the percentage that individuals in Russia were trading compared to their monthly wage was high. However, in the first half of 2024, the USA and the West have ramped up the sanctions that are being applied against financial institutions within Russia and overseas, making payments more difficult. And it's therefore extremely likely that the trading volumes have increased significantly, as have the volume compared to the monthly wage. And what this tells us is that Russia is struggling to be able to use traditional payment methods and is now having to turn to crypto. As a result of the increased use of cryptocurrency by Russian businesses and individuals, the US and the UK are reviewing more than $20 billion worth of transactions that pass through a Russian-based virtual exchange as part of Allied efforts to crack down on the sanctions evasion. The payments under scrutiny went through Moscow-based crypto exchange Garantex, using the dollar-pegged cryptocurrency Tether. The transfers have taken place since Garantex was sanctioned by the US and the UK on suspicion of enabling financial crimes and illicit transactions in Russia. Joe Biden's administration has been attempting to squeeze crypto exchanges like Garantex since the early days of the war, and the $20 billion worth of transactions would represent one of the biggest breaches of the sanctions. Tether, a so-called stablecoin that aims to maintain a one-to-one value with the dollar, is the world's most traded cryptocurrency, with more than 100 billion worth of coin in circulation. Tether Holdings, the company that created Tether, said in response to questions about the US-UK inquiry that it has frozen all the assets of entities with addresses on the US sanctions list. With Tether, every action is online, every transaction is traceable, every asset can be seized, and every criminal can be caught, the company said in a statement. We work with law enforcement to do exactly that. Recently, Garantex said it prevents the use of the exchange for illicit activities and actively cooperated with European and US authorities until it was sanctioned. It said it still cooperates with other international law enforcement agencies and tries to steer clear of facilitating criminal activities. Garantex was founded in 2019 in Estonia, though the US government has said that most of its operations are now based out of Federation Tower in Moscow. Estonia stripped the exchange of its license to operate in the Baltic nation in February 2022 as the result of a coordinated effort with the USA. In April 2022, the US accused Garantex of allowing its systems to be abused by illicit actors, including by disregarding its anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing obligations. The US has linked Garantex transactions to more than $100 million worth of illicit activity, including those involved in Russia-based ransomware hacking group Conti. Garantex says on its website that it allows withdrawals via Sberbank of Russia, PJSC, Tinkoff Bank, JSC and Alpha Bank AO cards, Russian banks that have been sanctioned by the US and some of its allies. While Tether helps investors swap between tokens and exchanges and shelter digital wealth from price swings, its anonymity, speed and stability have also made it popular with criminals. Once acquired on crypto exchanges and transferred to anonymous wallets, Tether can be sent anywhere instantly without Tether Holdings knowing the identity of senders or receivers. Tether is the most used currency for so-called online pig butchering investment scams run out of giant compounds in Southeast Asia, which have taken in billions of dollars from victims in the USA, China and around the world. Tether was also the most used stablecoin for criminal activity in 2023, according to analysis by TRM Labs, which linked it to $19.3 billion worth of illicit transactions compared with $24.7 billion in 2022. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to make this video because the issue of payments is a really big deal. You can do as much trade as you like. Russia can trade with China and India and any country that it likes. However, if it can't get paid, then obviously there's no point doing that business, because that's the fundamental reason why Russia is exporting things to all these countries. It wants the cash so that it can use it for buying imports and also for funding the war in Ukraine. And what we've seen in today's video is that the sanctions that are being applied against Russia are now being widened to other countries. So they're being told, if we find that you're dealing with the institutions that have been sanctioned, then that means that you yourself will then face sanctions, and effectively you will be in the same position as those Russian companies. You won't be able to access anything from the West, you won't be able to make payments, and basically you will lose all of your business. And as we saw earlier in the video, the level of business coming from Russia to China is significantly lower than the amount of business going from China to Russia. Today, China is a really important player in the Russian economy. It accounts for around a third of all of its exports and all of its imports. But in terms of Russia's importance to China, it is so much smaller, less than 5%. And so from China's point of view, they want to protect the 95% of business that they're doing with the rest of the world. And the Chinese financial institutions are very wary of the risk of secondary sanctions. They simply don't want to go down that road and cause themselves any problems. So what we saw in the video was that middlemen have now sprung up. We've got these regional banks, very small players that have been established on the region close to Russia in China, that are able to make these payments. However, the US is aware of this, and it's highly likely that those institutions will be hit by sanctions in the near future. And even if they aren't, they're so small that they can't really process the volume of transactions that Russia needs in order to make all of these payments. And payments is a big problem from Russia's point of view. And that's the reason why they're now starting to look at some other options. And as I mentioned in the intro to this video, there's actually been some reports of Russian and Chinese businesses bartering, so agreeing to supply things in two directions and then just equalize all of those payments. So basically no money is being transferred, they're just swapping goods. Now obviously those proposals, those deals are being put forward by the Russians because they're the ones who have problems actually making and receiving payments. And from China's point of view, I think there's limited mileage in terms of agreeing bartering. This is like going back 2,000 years to a time before anybody had any monetary systems in place. But in terms of the other alternatives, crypto is now becoming a very real alternative for Russian companies. And we've seen a huge surge in the use of crypto by Russians, both individuals and companies. And that's likely to continue until some form of regulation is put into place. And we've talked about this in previous videos. The crypto markets are generally unregulated. There is some regulation that's coming in the USA, and obviously some people have been indicted and found guilty of fraud. However, in terms of controlling the blockchain, it is quite difficult. Now, the blockchain itself does provide a detailed record of all of the transactions. That's the whole point of it, that you have everything recorded. So there is a potential that all of those records could be checked. And so you can't really get away from the fact that the deals have been done. However, it's going to be extremely time consuming to go through all of that data, and then to try to prosecute people is something I think that we are quite a long way away from at the moment. So over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, I think it's likely that Russia will continue to face extreme sanctions. The payments options available to it will continue to reduce, and that's going to cause major problems for Russia because it needs the cash from its exports. It's not just doing this for the good of the world, it's doing it because it needs the money to pay for imports and also to keep the war effort going in Ukraine. So Russia does need to find a solution to this problem. Crypto potentially could become a larger solution for Russia. However, if the sanctions are able to be applied against crypto, then obviously that would cut off that channel. And I think that's one of the issues that's now being investigated in terms of how can these sanctions actually stretch into the world of crypto? Or is this simply just a bridge too far at the moment? Maybe this is something that AI can solve at some point over the next year or so. But the overall summary of today's video is that Russia continues to find that it's having difficulties both making and receiving payments. That's causing a problem for the Russian economy. The sanctions are becoming more comprehensive, making it more difficult for Russia to find loopholes and ways around this system. And if the sanctions continue to squeeze Russia, that means that its cash flow will be restricted. It may still be doing a lot of trade and recording all of these deals, but if it's not being paid, that's going to cause a problem for Russia because it's currently draining its reserves, funding the war in Ukraine. And if that situation continues, at some point, those reserves will run out. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And here's something to put a smile on your face.